Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you're joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Stitcher Radio, Ghana, Himalaya, wherever you find your podcast. And also, please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Our guest today is Daniel Willingham. He's here to help us outsmart our brains. Before we invite Dan into the studio, we want to invite you to connect with us on social media. Facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Reading With Your Kids on Instagram, at Jedley Magic on Twitter. Also, would love for you to check out our Reading With Your Kids channel on YouTube, our Reading With Your Kids page on Pinterest, and of course, we'd love for you to visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. You can sign up for our free online magazine at readingwithyourkids.com and also be the first to know when we launch our new project. It's coming soon. It's called Drawing with Your Kids. Illustrators from all over the world are going to teach you and your kids how to draw some of their favorite characters. Oh, you can also use the contact button at the top of the page to let us know what we're doing well, let us know what we could be doing better, and let us know who you would like to hear on a future episode of the podcast. Join us right now from the beautiful state of Virginia. Our guest is here today to celebrate his new book. It's going to be released in January of 2023. We can pre-order it now. It's called Outsmart Your Brain. Please welcome to the show, Dan Willingham. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm great, Jed. I hope you are.
I am. Both of us are prepared for fall. We're here in our official team hoodies, getting ready to welcome the cold. Dan, what's Outsmart Your Brain all about?
It's really all about helping students and helping parents help their children learn how to regulate their own learning. Now, regulate your own learning sounds a little odd or a little scary or something. Really, all I'm referring to is the fact that as children move through school, they become increasingly responsible for their own learning. When children are very young, like in preschool or something, our expectations are 100% on the teacher, right? It's up to the teacher to set up an environment where the child is going to learn. But by the time children graduate from high school, our expectations are very high of their ability to be in control of their own learning. We send them home with difficult readings to do, with the expectation that if they have trouble, they're going to be resourceful in figuring out, how to make sense of something that's complicated. They're expected to know how to commit things to memory. If they're feeling anxious about their work, we expect that they're going to be able to deal with it somehow. And the way most people end up dealing with these tasks is candidly not very effectively. But it's not really their fault, because your brain leads you to do the thing that both feels easy but also feels effective. But the thing that feels easy and effective frequently actually isn't. It's usually easy, but it's frequently not very effective. So hence the title, Outsmart Your Brain. You need to sort of get around what your brain is biased to do and engage strategies for learning and reading that are the ones that are actually going to be effective for you.
Now, this is really fascinating. I actually took one of those giant online learning courses about the best ways to learn. And I was really surprised to discover that we kind of do it all wrong here. It's like everything that's kind of ingrained with us. Sit down and get that nose to the grindstone and keep grinding. If you can't get it now, just don't get up. Just keep on grinding. And that's scientifically proven to be the worst idea.
Well, it may not be. The worst is probably doing absolutely nothing, but it's not. Right. Or deciding, well, this is where I'm going to have a drink. That would probably be worse. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's not the most effective. And I'll tell you something, Jed, this is when I decided to become a memory researcher, is when I was taking a course in human memory and I learned that the intention to learn, wanting to learn, contributes absolutely nothing to the chances that you're going to remember something later. Which, when you think about it, like it totally makes sense. Your mind is cluttered with all these things that you never intended to learn. And naturally, there are things that you really do want to remember. And, you know, for example, names of someone who you meet. And that doesn't seem to have any impact either. So instead, what's really good for memory is typically it's thinking about meaning, because the way you're going to remember something later is based on the way that you're thinking about it now. And usually what we want to remember later is what something means. So the thing to do is think about meaning as you're encountering the content that you want to remember.
Interesting. So let's take this. Let's pretend that my kids aren't adults right now and they're 12 or 13, and they're struggling with algebra or pre-algebra. How can I help them put some meaning into these algebraic formulas that they're supposed to memorize?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And math in particular, so often people just sort of go at it with sort of brute force memorization. And it's very, very hard to commit things to memory when you don't know what they mean. Just the meaningless content is about the hardest memory task that you can imagine. So that really is job one. Is the first thing is to do is ask your child, do you understand this? Do you know what these formulas are doing? If you're trying to approach math simply by memorizing the formula and then hoping you recognize this, a problem type as, this would be a good formula to apply to this problem, that's going to be very, very difficult. Once you understand it, it's going to be a whole lot easier. Same thing applies if we're talking about an English class or a history class. Start with what things mean and then develop study materials based on what they mean. So pose meaningful questions to yourself and then practice answering those questions as a way to get things sticking.
Going back again to that example of trying to teach a 13-year-old, I imagine, and I'm looking back at both my son and my daughter, and they were very different students, and I think they would have very different response to me. My son might have said, yeah, I got this, just to get me out of the room. And my daughter might have said, yeah, I have this, and then give an explanation that I just don't understand. and
right.
I go, oh, I guess you do
right.
get that.
Right.
So how can we do? LeVar Burton was on the show, and he said that the reason that he became so passionate about reading is that he saw his mom reading all the time. How can we kind of do that same thing for our kids? Let them see us putting these strategies into effect in our everyday lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think LeVar Burton touched on something very, very important. When children perceive that learning is a family value, they're much more likely to internalize it. Modeling is part of that. So, obviously, if I say yes, in our family, we really value learning, but, I'm just always on my iPad watching videos and I'm never reading, right? That's obviously, it's going to be obvious to my child that this is phony. But there's more to it than modeling. I mean, I think showing that, we are a family that values learning new things. We're curious about the world. We're always trying to learn new things. This plays out in many different ways. I mean, for example, how do you communicate with your children about why they're in school? Is it always, this is about grades, this is about, you want to be able to get into a good college and you want to get a good job? I mean, for a 13-year-old, that's like talking about Mars, right? That's so far in the future. But if you're showing your child that you value learning by things like, who does your family talk about with respect? Who's set up as a hero in your family? What are the family myths. Every family has stories that they repeat over and over again. Every family has rituals, things that they do, whether it's by season, once a year, whatever it is. Every family has things that they do. These are the things that sort of give shape to our family. This is how your child knows. I visit my friends. Their house feels different, right, than our house does. And what your child probably couldn't articulate it, but what they're sensitive to in that moment is things like family values. And I think it's those day in, day out experiences that tell children one of the things we do in this family is we value learning, we love learning. That sends a very powerful message. And circling back to grades, it sort of reflects on how children think about school. Yes, of course, the expectation is that you're going to work hard, you're going to study, you're going to respect your teachers. That's part of this larger complex of attitudes. It's not just about you're going to do those things because you have to get good grades so you can get into a good college and get a good job. You're doing those things because that's who we are as a family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. As you were speaking, I was reminded, we come across all these different benefits of reading with your kids and the benefits of reading. And one of the things I have come across repeatedly is this statistic or thought that if you have 20 books, if your kid has 20 books in their family library, their chances of going to university are so much better than kids who don't have any books. And I guess that's kind of like because we have books in our home, we're kind of valuing learning and reading, and that's kind of what you were talking about?
Absolutely. So, books in the home has been used for many, many years by sociologists as sort of a very precise measure of something that's actually a very general construct, which is sort of to what extent does this family value learning? Do they value reading as part of learning? Books in the home serve several functions. One, it's a signal that we value learning in this house, and we this may be a house where we don't have a lot of money, but one of the things we elect to spend money on is books. And it is also sort of a symbol to the child. The amount of room in a home to display things, for things to be out and visible, is limited. And so if one of the things that you choose to sort of display in your home is books, that is another way that you are communicating family values to your children.
I love that. And we've talked about how important reading with your kids is to instill values in our kids. It's much more effective to sit down and read a story and talk about a story that is able to touch upon different values that you want your kids to embrace, as opposed to sitting down and lecturing them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you think about it when you're talking about reading. The percentage of families in this country that read aloud with their children is actually quite high when children are young. And as children age, it drops off. And especially when children are able to read independently, it disappears in most families. Parents stop reading to children. And when you think about it, like the message that sends is, I was reading to you because you were unable to read for yourself. Now you are, therefore there's no reason for me to read. But if you're continuing to read aloud with your child, even when they can do it themselves, it sends a very different message, which is, I value my time with you. I value learning together. And I value, discovering new things together. And I think that's an attitude most parents, if you explicitly point out, like, this is kind of a silent message that this is carrying. I think most parents would be on board with that. Yeah. And, they would love to continue reading with their kids. One
of the best things that happened to me is my daughter's second grade teacher. She came to me and said, your daughter's reading is really improved. This is fantastic. I'm like, oh, great. And she goes, keep reading with her. And I'm like, wait a minute. You just said she was a great reader. She's like, yeah, keep reading with her. I'm like, I was really happy. I was like, I have permission to continue reading because I really dig this.
Nice. Yeah, and another thing, if parents out there need further persuasion on this, consider that, yes, your child can read independently, but listening comprehension is always ahead of reading comprehension. So you can read books together that are at a higher level, more complex narratives than they would be able to read independently. So if you need yet one more reason to keep reading, that's maybe that'll speak to you.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can outsmart our brains. You talked about giving meaning to things. I'm imagining that history would be a great place to do this instead of just sitting down and helping kids, with flashcards. Okay, October 4th, 1875. What happened then? To sit down and go, okay, on October whatever, this is what happened, and this is why it's important to us today, a couple hundred years later.
Absolutely. Putting things, when it's history in particular, putting things into context is so important. I mean, something happened in 1812, not just because, it just sort of happened to happen that day. There's a backstory, right? Events were leading up to whatever event it is that you're thinking about in 1812. But a more general thing that parents can do, in addition to encouraging children to think about what it means, don't just commit it to memory, is to help children understand the differences in the type of reading that they're going to be asked to do as they get into upper elementary years and beyond. One of the things that kids have trouble with is when they first learn how to read, they're mostly reading stories, right? They're reading narratives. And narratives have a very predictable structure, and it's a very linear structure. Event B was caused by event A, and so forth. And so it's pretty easy for them to piece things together. As they start to get up into the upper elementary grades and they start reading textbooks and other more complex nonfiction works, they're organized differently. They're usually organized hierarchically. And in addition, their children are reading for a different purpose. They're no longer reading for the purpose of pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. And in a way, the author is not coming to the reader anymore. When you're in the early elementary years, the authors are working really hard to make this interesting, to make this comprehensible. They want kids to read their books. Speaking as a textbook author, that's not really first in the mind of a lot of textbook authors, right? You have to get the information in there. And if you can make it interesting, so much the better. But that different organization, this is getting back to your original point, Jed, about meaning. The fact that it's organized hierarchically, the fact that it's jam-packed with information, and most of this information is going to be new to you, means that comprehension is much more difficult. And kids need to tackle reading like that. If they're to make it meaningful, they need different reading strategies than they are used to deploying. And many kids, when they read textbooks, and this habit continues up to college where I'm instructing, their strategy in reading is like, they read the way they read a novel. You sit down and you start reading. And sitting down and starting to read is fine if the author is coming to you and trying to make things easy. But for most of the things, most of the texts they're going to encounter in their other classes, that's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. So what will work in those situations?
Most parents will have heard of the SQ3R method, which stands for, it's basically a little strategy you're supposed to do before and during reading. So SQ is survey, question, and then 3R is read, recite, review. There are many strategies like this, and all of them basically turn on two core things. One is don't just sit down and start reading. Prepare by thinking through what is it I'm likely to get out of this? Like, why was this assigned? Like, this was assigned for a class. What is my teacher thinking I'm going to get out of this? And then briefly look at the headings and subheadings of the reading to see whether you probably sized it up correctly. It looks like this is the information I was expecting is going to be covered here. Then that's the preview part. Then the second part is, as you're reading, periodically take a step back from the text and think, what is it that this is? What is it I'm getting out of this? And so that if you pose questions in the beginning, so SQ is survey and then question. If you pose some questions, here's what I think I'm going to get out of this. Let me pose some questions to myself. as you're reading, you can think to yourself, am I getting the answers to this? Let me see if I can answer these questions. So when we think about encouraging children, look, you've got to think about meaning, not only to understand, but also if there's going to be a test or a quiz or something, you need to know what things mean to be able to study and answer those effectively. This is the best strategy for getting the meaning out of complex readings. And then at the end, sort of review, what have I learned from this? And, do I feel pretty good about what I've come to understand? Do I think I got it?
Yeah. Excuse me if this sounds like a simple way to kind of recap what you're saying, but I'm a simple-minded person. We talk a lot here on the podcast with our young readers of taking picture walks through a book before we read it, to sit down and just look at the pictures and have a conversation with our kids. What do you think this book is about? What do you think this picture is all about? What do you think the story might be? And then go in and, as you're reading the story, reflect back. Hey, how did we do when we were thinking about this? Were we right? Were we completely right? It doesn't matter. It's just interesting. Could doing that with our kids on a regular basis be a kind of way to prep our kids early on to kind of get into the habit of, thinking what are we going to be learning when we sit down and try to tackle this tough text?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it serves very similar purposes when you're reading a textbook as it does with young children when they're learning about reading narratives. Same sort of thing of sort of preparing your mind for what's to come and setting up some expectations. That's going to help make things make sense for sure.
What about one of the things I learned, this idea that, I'm not getting it. I just got to sit down here and keep pounding my brain and get it and get it and get it. One of the things I learned was that it's really good to learn things in chunks. And if you're hitting a wall, instead of continuing to hit the wall, get up and take a walk. Do some exercise, and then come back to it 5-10 minutes later. Absolutely.
Yeah. Those sorts of resets can definitely be really helpful. Breaks in general are definitely helpful. They're helpful for attention. If you find yourself distracted, taking a break, plenty of evidence that taking breaks really does help. There's not any evidence, by the way, of like exactly what you should be doing during a break. People have looked into that, or exactly like how long do you work and then how long is the break? People have examined that. No clear picture has emerged. Many people say something like work for 20 minutes and then take a 3-minute break or something like that. But you can fool with it. The other thing you can try is, if you've been working at something, you just can't make sense of it. You've had a break, you've come back, it doesn't work. Work on something else. Mm-hmm. And especially if, you're a little bit ahead of the game, you can then tackle it again tomorrow. And, we've all been in that situation where you come back to something the next day and you're like, oh my gosh, why was I struggling with this? Now it makes a whole lot more sense than it did yesterday. Or, absent that, like, text a friend and ask if they've got it figured out, or talk to your teacher or something like that.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to touch on. I think there are some kids that have no problem at all going to a teacher and say, I don't get this. Can you help me out? And then there's a whole lot of other kids that are like, oh, talk to the teacher. No, they're going to think, whether they're going to think I'm dumb, or kids are going to think I don't know what the term is these days, but they think I'm trying to shine on to the teacher. But I think you know what I'm getting at. How can we encourage our kids to understand that it's okay to ask for help? You're not failing. You're not a dummy. And actually asking for help is the really intelligent way to go.
Yeah, I mean, what I always point out to students is, it's like athletics. I mean, there are differences in ability. There on every team, there's that one kid who just seems to have enormous ability, and it's like they don't even have to try. But if they don't try, they're never the best on the team. And even though everybody knows one kid like that, almost nobody is like that, right? Mm-hmm. Most people get good at athletics because they work really hard at it. And they've got a coach who's telling them, oh, look, here, do it this way. Let me help you out. This isn't working out so well. And academics is no different. Most people have to work at it really hard. And the way you learn how to work at it is by asking questions. That's one thing, is that your child may have the wrong idea about what it means to be smart. Smart people are people who aren't afraid to face up to the fact that they don't understand things and they ask for help. That's what, as someone who's been in education for over 30 years now, I can confidently tell you those are the kids who do really well in my classes, are the kids who ask questions and are working hard at it. Yeah. So that's one thing that they may be a little bit mistaken about. The other thing they may be mistaken about is how the teacher perceives it, that the teacher perceives it as a nuisance if you're asking for help or something like that. And there I think parents can talk to them and sort of help children see, no, first of all, this is very old stuff. This is what your teacher is expecting. Mm-hmm. Most teachers enjoy it. What's much more frustrating for us is if there's a student in our class who's struggling and they won't come to us and ask for the help. And it's certainly not wasting our time. I mean, again, this is like, we're dedicating our life to this. This is what we're here for. Mm-hmm. So don't think that should be an obstacle to seeking out help.
Yeah. So important. It's interesting you brought up the idea of athletics. Isn't it telling that, most most athletes have more coaches helping them learn certain skills than they'll have teachers helping them learn certain knowledge.
In some contexts, absolutely. Yeah. That's the case, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so just to check, we always talk about, how can we help our kids discern? Because kids these days are inundated with information. They're just bombarded with information. Yeah. And when we have people from the news media on, we talk to them about, how can they discern what information to trust that they're experiencing online. I just happened to see a thing on Instagram this morning that said, hey, you're studying something really hard. Before you start studying, put a little fragrance on your wrist and sniff that. And as you're reading, keep sniffing that. And then when you go and you take the test, you sniff that again, because now you have that connection with the what should kids do with that?
Yeah, no, that's not going to work.
So we have to help our kids understand what learning information and skills they're seeing online, what should be trusted and what shouldn't be.
Right. So, I mean, I think that by far the simplest thing to do is to teach your children to distinguish among different sources, and in particular, to find a limited number of trusted sources. And no source is going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. But, major newspapers, they make their living by being trustworthy. And there are other, sources of Wikipedia is actually quite reliable in terms of encyclopedias. So teaching your children what are the reliable sources. And, when I think a very destructive idea actually is the do your own research idea, which you hear a lot. The time you most often hear the phrase do your own research is by someone who believes a really kooky idea. And they've spent a lot of time, going down the rabbit hole of some strange idea. But the truth is, most of us don't do our own research. We rely on experts and the credentials of experts all the time. When I go to my doctor, I don't and I don't feel well. My doctor says, here, you need to take this medicine. I don't say, okay, well, I'll use that as a starting point for thinking up my own course of treatment. Thank you for your input. But we'll see. And likewise, when an electrician comes in, I say, go do your thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're, even though it sounds like kind of noble or important to say, like, you should do your own research, you should also respect the expertise of people who have trained for what they're doing, have been at it for a very long time, and recognize that doing your own research is actually really hard. I mean, there are very few topics on which I feel competent to do my own research. So I would much rather read an article in a major newspaper or look at Wikipedia and find out what experts who've been at this for years say the truth is about something.
Awesome. Well,
and that's what I teach my kids.
Well, we need to know the truth as to where we can go to find out more about Outsmart Your Brain and find out more about you, Dan.
Well, you can find out more about me. I do have a website, danielwillingham.com. Anything that I've written to which I have the copyright is available for download there. It actually amounts to a fair number of articles. There is a website for Outsmart Your Brain, which is through Simon & Schuster, my publisher, and I hope to see folks online.
We've had a really fun and fascinating time talking to the author of Outsmart Your Brain. It's available for pre-order now. It will be available to be in your library in January of 2023. Our guest has been Dan Willingham. Hey, Dan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. It's been a lot of fun.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We have a very special guest coming. I'm really, really excited about this guest. You're going to love him. You're going to love him. I'm just going to tell you that. You're going to love him. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Daniel Willingham. Please be sure to pre-order Outsmart Your Brain. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Mirabella Q, Jordan Saley, Stephanie Davila, Skylar Strauss. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking to you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.